Thank you, guys. Appreciate that. Hopefully, you'll be clapping at the end. And I have a tendency to give you a whole ton of information that maybe right now isn't as useful as um, and where you're at in ministry, but at some point it will be. And so I don't know. Can we kill that one monitor, or is that possible? If not, we'll just that's better. Thanks. Um, so what we're going to talk about tonight is church administration. And as Pastor Scott said, and he and I have known each other, I think, close to 20 years. Scott, when did you come back to New Mexico? What year was that? 2002. So we're coming up on 20 years that we have spent time together, been in ministry together. Uh, what's that? I was 12, and we've built churches together. We worked together on the first church he had over there up on San Antonio, and then the one next door, and then this one. And so it's been really neat to see God doing the work here at Cross Christian Fellowship, and just being a part of Scott and his ministry, and it's just been a really good blessing. And as Scott mentioned, I was the administrative pastor for 11 years, Calvary Chapel, Rio Grande Valley, and have spent a lot of time then and since then helping churches with the business side of church. Um, and I don't know where each of you are at in ministry and what your uh, goal is to be a pastor. Some of you may be assistant pastors, administrators, whatever God calls you to do. Maybe it's a ministry not in a church. Maybe it's a prison ministry. Maybe it's a homeless shelter. All of those things. There's things that you need to know about in doing those kinds of ministry. So tonight we're going to talk about church administration, and not sure which button, either one works. So there we go. So our main focus tonight is the business side of church. And I want you to remember that statement that's up there on the screen right now is a church is not a business. Now, there are some churches in our society that operate as a business, but church is not a business. It's a ministry. But it does have a business aspect to it, and failure to do the business requirements can cause the ministry a lot of grief. It's just something that has to be done. And when you're small and you're the senior pastor and the janitor and the administrator and the banker and all of those things, you have to know all of these things to make ministry fun like it's supposed to be. And we want ministry to be fun. And so what we're going to talk about tonight, I'm going the wrong direction, is here's what we're going to cover. Kind of seven groups of things: how to get started, the church organizational structure. We're going to talk about 501c3 and what that means. I'm sure you've all heard that thrown around, and maybe ministries that you give to are 501c3s. What that means for your church, what that means for you getting started. General accounting things, some things about human resources. Then if we have time, we'll talk about facilities and certainly questions and answers. I'm really good with questions, not always good with answers, so just keep that in mind. And we can take questions after each kind of one of these sessions that we're going to go through. So in getting started, the first one, these are the things we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about developing your vision and mission, developing your statement of faith, talking about the publication 1828, the Tax Guide for Churches, which will become very, very important to you. I have a copy up here. I printed it double-sided because it's 42 pages long. It's done by the IRS, your friend, the IRS. how to get an EIN number, and then how to open a bank account. So those are the things that we're going to look at. So developing your vision. And the vision is what God has put on your heart to accomplish. And I believe that every church needs a vision. And it is simply, where are we going? What is the focus of the church? And every church doesn't have the same vision. Every church has the same vision, hopefully, as preaching the gospel, but not every church has the same vision as far as what they're going to do beyond that. So what kind of outreaches are you going to do? What kind of ministries? I have a friend that in the church he attends, their whole mission is to evangelize Egypt. The pastor's from Egypt. He's in Tulsa, Oklahoma, but everything they do has a focus for what's going on in Egypt and discipling people in Egypt. That's their vision. That's their mission. And he tells people when they come to church here, he says, here's our vision. Here's what we do. And if your vision isn't that, then maybe this isn't the church for you, right? Because every church has a little bit of a different focus, and that's fine. It's simply where you're going. I also believe it's what you share and what you emphasize during your conversations, during your preaching, and during your teaching. My main focus with people is discipleship. I love discipling people, and as far as my ministry is, it's all about discipleship. We're a church that disciples, teaches people how to disciple and share with one another. We'll share that in a minute. I know if you've been here long, and I know you guys have been here, this is your, how many, second year, right? You know what Scott's vision is, don't you? 2.5 years. Yeah, who's keeping track? If you've been listening to Pastor Scott very long, you know what his vision is, don't you? You guys are part of his vision. He wants to disciple men to go out and start ministries and share and spread the gospel, right? Kind of got a delay here. So it's what you talk about in conversation. I forget that what I'm looking at and what you're seeing are two different things. You want to bring it up all the time. Again, Proverbs 29:18 says, where there is no vision, the people perish or cast off restraint. Right? And so developing this vision. The mission is a short synopsis of how you're going to accomplish the vision. The vision may be broad, but the mission is very pointed and is what's easy to speak about. So this is one of my earlier visions. I've expanded it just a little bit, but it was to, our mission is to see people become disciples of Jesus by showing them God's love and by teaching them God's word and helping them do the same for others. So we want to love them, and then we want to teach them, and in doing that, we want them to go out and replicate that. And so that is the mission. So the next thing we talk about, so we talked about vision and mission. The next thing we want to talk about is statement of faith. A statement of faith is a specific statement of what you believe. A lot of people use the Apostles' Creed, have some expanded versions of that. And it addresses specific essentials. One God, one Spirit, one baptism. What is marriage? How was creation done? All of those things. And you might be surprised that some churches have different versions of all those things, right? I mean, creation is a big one. Some even say, well, God created over the Big Bang Theory or whatever, right? Or was it a literal 7 days? Or was it 7 1,000-year periods because a day is worth 1,000 years? So it is really spelling out what you believe and why you believe that. Now, this is a statement of faith from one of the churches that I was at, and you'll find it somewhat comical and also very sad. So, this is the statement about marriage. in the statement of faith, and it's in my current statement of faith at the church that I pastor right now. We believe that marriage is exclusively the legal union of one genetic male and one genetic female, sanctioned by the state, evidenced by marriage ceremony. We also believe that legitimate biblical sexual relations are exercised solely within marriage, hence sexual activities such as, but not limited to, adultery, fornication, premarital sex, incest, polygamy, homosexual, transgenderism, bisexuality, cross-dressing, and do I need to go on, right, is all in a statement. Well, now, why would we need a statement of faith like that? Exactly. Exactly. So I had the privilege of having COVID in December, and after when you get COVID, the state calls you and asks you questions. I don't know if any of you had COVID or not, but the state will call you and ask you, where did you contract it and who have you been in contact with, and you have to isolate, and they give you all these things. The guy was really nice. We're going through the conversation. I got fever and chills going on, and he says to me, "What sex were you on your birth certificate?" And I said, "Excuse me?" He goes, "What sex was listed on your birth certificate?" And I told him, and he says, "Okay, I'm sorry about the next question." He goes, "And what do you identify with now?" That's where our society is. That's where our society is. I told him a gorilla, but I mean, I just told him, I said, "You got to be kidding me. You have got to be kidding me." He says, "I'm really sorry, sir. I have to ask you that question." I said, "Okay, well, you know the answer to that." We moved on. But this is what our society is, right? And we have to stand up and say, we love these people. We love the people that are involved in these things, right? That's part of our mission. We want to love people and make them disciples. But we also have to stand for truth and say, these things are not acceptable. These things go against God and His Word. Okay. Next thing we're going to do is talk about the tax guide for churches. So again, we're still talking about getting started, right? So having a vision, mission statement, a statement of faith, and then we're going to talk about how to get things going from a governmental standpoint. So I talked about the tax guide for churches. That's this publication, 1828. You can get it by just going to www.irs.gov and just type in tax guide for churches. This will pop up. It comes out as a PDF. You can print it. It has not changed since 2015 as the copy that I have. This will give you a ton of great information that will put you to sleep at night if you're having trouble sleeping. But it does have some good information. You want to read it thoroughly. It does give you the requirements for tax exempt status, and it recognizes recognition of what tax exempt status is and how to apply for it if you choose to apply for tax exempt status. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a little bit. The next thing you need to do is get an EIN number. So that's an employment identification number. Every entity has to have one. It's very easy to get. Again, you go to irs.gov, type in EIN. It will walk you through how to get one. It will take you maybe 20 minutes, and they'll have the number almost instant. But before you do it, you ought to go in there and read what some of the questions are, because depending on how you answer questions may limit you in the future for how you do ministry. And you may have to get a second number or do something different. What do I mean by that? I think when Pastor Scott set up his, he included the ability to have radio stations, outreach centers, different kinds of things as part of the ministry, so you don't have a problem later with what. So if your vision is you want to do a ministry and maybe someday own a radio station, you want to include that in there. Maybe you never do. Maybe God never brings it about. But it's better to be broad and have it covered than not. Okay, so those are some questions that you'll need to answer. So the employee identification number. Again, it's a search box on irs.gov website. It's very easy to do. Um, I've helped some of you previous uh, guys get them. Um, I remember Chris up in Red River, who's now in Texas, but when he was getting his, he called me up one day. He goes, "I just can't figure this out." And I said, "Come by my office," and in 10 minutes we had him a EIN number. Um, so that's pretty easy to get. The next thing is opening a bank account. So it's not as simple as just walking into the bank and saying, "I need a bank account." You can do that for yourself personally, but when you need it for a church, every bank is a little different on what they require to give you an account with your ministry name on it. And so you'll want to contact your bank. You'll have to have an EIN number. Some want the mission statement. Some want a resolution by the board of directors to open the account. And some want all signers to be present. So just remember that when you're going to go get it, that you want to contact them and say, "Hey, I'm starting a church, and what do you want for me to open a bank account?" Some banks are way more friendly than other banks when it comes to churches, so you just might maybe even want to call around, right? And um, so it's very easy, and you'll have to have one. Why do you have to have a church account? Well, what if you have church and somebody gives you a tithe, an offering? What are you going to do with it? You got to have an account to put it in. And what if you need to pay, a bill or do something? You have to have an account to do all that. And we'll talk about accounting in a minute. But these are all the things that you have to get started in your church. So, or ministry. So that was kind of the first section, kind of quick, getting started. Any questions on that before we kind of go on? And if there's something that you asked that I'm going to cover later, I'll just say, "Hey, we're going to get to that in a minute." Any questions at all? Yes, sir. Well, you need an avenue to be able to pay bills and receive income. Now, how you can do that, I mean, I don't know of other than a sock in your drawer, I don't know of a way to do that without having some institution, whether it's an insurance company or something. Um, I don't know how you would do that. Yes, sir. We're going to get to that. Yeah, we will get to that here in just a minute. Yeah. A lot of discussion about 501c3. So we'll talk a lot about it because when I'm done, you'll still go, "Do I have to get a 501c3 or not?" Right? So any other questions on this initial part? Okay. So the next thing we want to talk about is church organization. So there's several structures in church organization. And I guess to answer your question a little better, you can not do some of this stuff, but are you really going to be an entity that people are going to trust to give you tithes and offerings that they know are tax deductible, right? So that's one of the only things the government gives us anymore, right? Is that you can still deduct your charitable donations to a church. And to some people, that's very important. I mean, I don't know about you guys, but I get robocalls all day long, and it's this fireman's association, that one. I ask them, "Are you a 501c3? No. I'm not giving you any money, right? Because what are you doing with that money? I don't know what you're doing. There's no accountability, right?" Yes, sir. Yes. Sure. don't have to do any of this. Right. No, it's not a dumb question. There are no dumb. Yeah, so if you're under your church umbrella and you're just doing a Bible study, there's another question up here. But you don't have to do any of that, right? Where you start needing to do this stuff is when you are a church and people are giving you contributions. Okay.
In your example about the firefighters, you said you don't trust anyone that doesn't have a 501c3, but there's other means of accountability, like a nonprofit corporation where there's got a board and stuff like that.
Sure.
Or do you automatically presume that without a 501c3 you don't have accountability?
I said accountability. That may have been a bad word, but you cannot. They don't publish things the same as a 501c3 would have to do, and your donations are not tax deductible if it's not a 501c3.
That part I know, but you were, yeah, okay, I got you.
Right.
So right now, our church is not a 501c3. For one, because it would have taken a large amount of the budget to even begin the process.
Right, and I'm going to talk about that in just a second.
Yeah, but
okay?
there's the other reason is just freedom to speak openly.
Yes and no. Even if you don't become a 501c3, according to the IRS, you still don't have freedom to speak completely openly. And I'll talk about that a little bit because we follow the Word of God, we follow the laws of the land according to Scripture until the point that it violates Scripture, right? So that's where the cutoff line is, right? And so we'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. So in this, we're going to talk about, whether you're unincorporated, nonprofit, corporation, charitable trust. Those are some of the structures that you can incorporate under in the state. For some reason, it kind of does this every now and then, right? Maybe you can advance it one for me. Okay, there we go. And then we'll talk about church government. There's pastor-led with a board of directors. There's pastor-led with elders. There's a board-run church, an elder-run church, and there's congregational-run churches. And these are all the kinds of governments that you have to decide what you're going to use in your church. Get caught up here. And you see several of these in Scripture, right? You see, and different churches use different forms of government. Pastor-led with board of directors, pastor-led with elders. And again, there's board-run churches where the pastor is not able to make certain decisions. There's elder-run churches, again, where the pastor's not able. And then there's congregational churches. And quite frankly, I've seen all of them run very, very well, and I've seen all of them run very, very poorly. So you really have to be careful how you set up your church if you're going to set up a church and be the pastor. You certainly want people around you that agree with the vision, that agree with the mission, and are going to be people that are going to challenge what you say, but are going to be willing to go with the vision, right? And I personally, if you ask me what I personally like a pastor-led church. The pastor is the one that God gives the vision. The pastor is the one that God anoints for that ministry, and then the men, whether they're elders or board or whatever, that come alongside, are there to help fulfill that ministry. So, incorporation is the most used. It is not hard to get, but like, so you have your statement of faith, which is a list of things. You'll then have to develop some bylaws, and then you'll have articles of incorporation. Now, when I talk about incorporation, this has nothing to do with the federal government. Incorporation's all on a state level, okay? So, uh, articles of incorporation can be very simple. They even have some forms that guide you on how to fill that out. And it will want, who's the original incorporator, what's the location, what's the duration, what's the purpose, initial board members. It will also talk about, they'll want bylaws, a complete list of governing articles. In other words, what's the purpose of the ministry? What's the objective? What type of membership? Are you voted in as members? Are you a member just by tithing and coming to church? And so different churches have different ways of doing that. What's the government of the church and what's the roles? So, if you have in a corporation, you have a president, vice president, secretary, and treasurer. And so what are the roles of those people in the organization? A lot of times the pastor is the president, an assistant pastor might be a vice president, or some board members might be a vice president, and then secretary and treasurer. And so, but you'll have to name these people when you incorporate. So membership, government and roles, accounting and accountability, ordination, licensing, and commission. So how is a pastor ordained? How is an assistant pastor ordained? Are they ordained or are they licensed or are they commissioned? And so some churches say, okay, the pastor's ordained, assistant pastors are licensed, and then somebody doing prison ministry or chaplaincy or something else is then commissioned by the church. And it's only while they're there working in the church's capacity. And then how do you remove and discipline? These are all the things that kind of come into play in bylaws. When you get to that point, I have a set of copies. I have some boilerplate bylaws. Pastor Scott's got some. We're here to help you do that when the time comes. And I know for a lot of you, this may be way down the road. So some of you is like, yeah, I'm just going to teach Bible study at home and I don't need to worry about this. But it's good to know, all right? So application and documents are filed with the state that you're incorporating in. So I mentioned Chris from Red River. Now that he's in Texas, he's got to reincorporate in Texas. Now his EIN number is good wherever he goes, but he's got to reincorporate in Texas. And I will say you don't have to do this the day one. You can start, if you do the things I said at the beginning, if you have your mission and your statement of faith and you get your EIN number and a bank account, you can start church on Sunday, right? You don't have to do this. This can come as you have time and are able to do it. You do want to file as a domestic nonprofit. And this is where it gets a little bit confusing with people is, again, state and federal are two completely different identities, different requirements, different laws. So in the state, you'll file as a domestic nonprofit. You're a nonprofit even if you never become a 501c3. And again, I'm going to talk a lot about 501c3s in a minute. So, but you always want to file that because that's what you're going to be as a nonprofit organization. Okay. Any questions about that before we get into 501c3? I know a lot of general information there, but again, you don't need to incorporate immediately. You do need to at some point. You're not a corporation, so you want to incorporate as a domestic nonprofit. For the state, it doesn't get you anything. That's just how you're registered with the state. Okay. Later, if you want to buy things tax deductible, then you can get tax forms and do things like that. So 501c3, big deal about 501c3. So it is not required for churches, which are called houses of worship. So in the tax guide that you should download and take a look at, it actually defines churches as a house of worship. Religious organizations that are not churches typically include non-denominational ministries, interdenominational and ecumenical organizations, and other entities whose principal purpose is the study or advancement of religion. Um, and so it is really a house of worship is what is considered a church. Um, when you get on page 2 of the book, it talks about tax exempt status, and it says churches and religious organizations, like many other charitable organizations, qualify for exemption from federal income tax under IRC section 501c3. Okay, so as a church, you automatically qualify to become a 501c3, which is a non-tax organization or tax exempt. The organization must meet the following requirements covered in greater detail throughout the publication. The organization must be organized and operate exclusively for religious, educational, scientific, or other charitable purposes. So you guys have all got the calls. You can have the Firemen's Association that's not a 501c3, and then another Firemen's Association that is a 501c3. The only difference between those two, I mean, there may be other differences. One is tax deductible, one is not tax deductible. So, also as a 501c3, net earnings may not inure to the benefit of any private individual or shareholder. So, the money coming in, for example, Presbyterian Hospital is a 501c3, right? So, the income from that cannot go specifically to one person or one entity, right? No substantial part of its activity may be attempted to influence legislation. So, as a church, you cannot be a 501c3 and be a lobbyist. The organization may not intervene in political campaigns, and the organization's purpose and activities may not be illegal or violate fundamental public policy. So that's the definition of tax exempt status of 501c3. But here's the real thing that you need to remember. Automatic exemption for churches. Churches that meet the requirements of IRC section 501c3, those points I just gave you, are automatically considered tax exempt. Okay, got that? Automatically tax exempt without filing any paperwork. To your comment a minute ago, the church has not filed for 501c3, and there is no legal reason or legal purpose to. They are automatically exempt because it is a church. They are automatically considered tax exempt and are not required to apply for and obtain recognition of tax exemption from the IRS. So again, it goes on to say, although there is no requirement to do so, many churches seek recognition of tax exempt status from the IRS because it's recognition assures church leaders, members, and contributors that the church is recognized as exempt and qualifies for related tax benefits. For example, contributors to a church that may be recognized as tax exempt would know that their contributions generally are tax deductible. And I'll address that a little bit. So it's very, very clear. You do not have to be a 501c3. If you are starting a church, a house of worship, you are automatically exempt. It will go on to tell you prison ministries, shelters, all of those other kinds of ministries do not fall, they're not houses of worship. So if you want to do that kind of ministry and you want to be able to accept donations and give tax receipts for those, then you then have to file for a 501c3. He's absolutely correct. It's expensive and it's time consuming. And it's actually generally better to do it after you've been going for maybe a year or more, because they're going to want income numbers. They're going to want a whole lot of things, and sometimes it even makes sense to have a tax attorney or somebody like that help you get all that documentation together. Um, It costs $1,200 to, if you're under a certain amount of income per year, to send in to get tax exempt status. And if you have one thing wrong, they reject you and you have to send it again. And guess what? They charge you again and they charge you again until you get it right. And so, um, the church I pastor now was started in 1977, and we are not a 501c3, have not been in 42 years. And how I address and we address donations, obviously, we'll talk about it. We give out tax letters every year to people who contribute, which is a requirement. But any corporation or whatever that is concerned, well, hey, I want to give you this, but is it really going to be tax deductible? I take this right out of the IRS document and send it to them and says, this is what the IRS says, that we are tax deductible. And in every case, somebody that wanted to help us with a air conditioning unit or a roof or whatever, they go, oh, okay, great. You know, and that's the only reason for a 501c3 is to give assurance to the donor that it is tax deductible. And once you show, and most people generally know that if you're a church, it's a tax deductible thing, right? And so they don't worry about it. It's really corporations. If you're expecting a lot of corporate donors, things like that, then it may be very important for you to go get a 501c3. All right. So yes, it provides assurance to donors that their gift is tax deductible. It's a Form 1023. Again, current fee is $850 for income under $10,000 a year over 4 years. So if you haven't had more than $10,000 come in over 4 years, then it's that price. If it's over that, then the number does go up. One thing the government likes is money. They don't spend it well, but they take it. Was that mic on? I'm sorry. 501c3 continued. Again, it's required for ministries that are not churches, homeless shelters, rescue missions, prison ministries, food pantries. Again, if you're going to want to give out tax receipts and be tax deductible, that is what you'll have to do. Again, if it's not a house of worship, the definition is house of worship. So that applies to synagogues. All of those things are considered houses of worship. Any questions on that?
So you said that it's not required for churches because they're already tax exempt. Is there any objective evidence needed to be provided to the IRS to say that they're a church, or do they just take your word and faith in that?
They do.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Like I say, you could start on Sunday and you could say, this is, make up a name, the Rock Church or whatever, and and that's one of the reasons that it's important if you have a checking account that says the Rock Church on it, and if you have you have documentation, you have a board, right, that, or you have elders or whatever, you have things that say, hey, we are a church, and the honest truth is they don't check, they don't have a way of checking. They do once you start having employees, and we'll talk about that. But your EIN number does start triggering certain things. So
I'm just wondering what is sheltered under the name houses of worship. Does it have to be in the building? Like if you had a homeless shelter that was an outreach of the church, would that that would have to be 501c3 or maybe above?
So they do define, I'll find it for you. They do define in here what a house of worship is. So generally a house of worship is publication explains the benefits and the responsibilities under the federal tax system for churches and religious organizations. The term church is found but not specifically defined in the Internal Revenue Code. The term is not used by all faith. However, in an attempt to make this publication easy to read, we use it as a generic sense as a place of worship, including, for example, mosques and synagogues, with the exception of special rules for church audits. The use of the term church throughout this publication also includes conventions and associations of churches as well as integrated auxiliaries of a church. So, like the Southern Baptist Organization, okay, that's considered a church. And then there are affiliate churches all under that. And if you are in a denominational church setting, let's say you decide you want to be a First Baptist church, right? And so you go to the head First Baptist church. I don't know much about them, or what they call the denominational headquarters. Their 501c3 may cover you, and it may not. You may have to become one independently.
So by the definition in the tax code, would the radio station that Pastor Scott mentioned have to be on the property?
No.
Okay, so then you could have an outreach of the church somewhere else if it's listed in the original forms.
So let me get back to the EIN number. The EIN number that the government has is going to have the name, right? And so if it says Cross Christian Fellowship, and in the documents it says it's a church, it's a house of worship, and these are the things that we do, but we also want to include radio stations and whatever, Christian school, a homeless food pantry, all of those things, those all then fall under that umbrella of the church.
So can you go back and change the terminology associated with that EIN
No,
before you? Okay.
no. Once you do one EIN number, it's locked for that.
That's
That's
really
why you
important
want
for
to
me to-
be. That's why you want to expand that as much as you can when you go into it, because then you've covered things that you already may have on your heart, but it's okay, well, that could lead to this, and that, this could lead to that, right? And so you go on to, I always recommend, Christian schools, radio stations, things like that. But if you go in and you go get an EIN number and you say you're going to be a homeless shelter, that's not a house of worship, right? So you can say, I'm XYZ church, and you can have your homeless shelter, and you can have church at your homeless shelter. Now you're a house of worship, and then the homeless shelter is a sub-ministry of the house of worship. Okay, that's what you want to do. Is that clear on that? Yes, sir.
Matthew pretty much asked my question, but could you ditch the EIN number and get a new one?
So you can have a home Bible study. Again, if you want to give, if somebody, I come up and give you $100 and say, I want to help your church, and I want a receipt for that, without it, it's not really legal to do. I cannot claim that on my income tax if you have not registered yourself as a church legally.
But if you get a new EIN number first and then just replace it,
Yeah,
then
you
just
can.
get rid of it.
Yeah. Sure, absolutely. Yeah. And there are corporations today, businesses that have multiple EIN numbers. They have different divisions, subsidiaries, and they put all those under different. Those employees get paid under this one, and these employees get paid under that one. And so you can have. And if you get an EIN number and you start, and then you find out that's not the way you want to be, then you just get a new one and abandon the other one. I mean, they make it really easy. Part of being a church, especially under the 501c3, is you have to be careful of what's called unrelated business income tax, UBIT. And so a lot of churches have said, okay, well, I want to have a coffee shop and a bookstore and all these things, and all the income from those just goes into the church. That all sounds good, except for income producing activities may be taxable. A bookstore and the income you receive from the bookstore or the coffee shop, or if you rent some of your property, let's say you bought this whole strip this whatever it is, business strip, and you put your church in it, and then you rented the others out and say, okay, well, the rental income from those I'm just going to use in the church. You can, but you still have to pay income tax on it. Okay, so you have to be very careful about this, that rent received from properties or parking lots or whatever can be classified as unrelated business income, and you have to pay tax on it. So it is taxable if it meets all of these three things. It constitutes a trade or business. So a bookstore and a coffee shop, I'm going to use those for examples because those are common, is a trade and it's a business. Yes, sir.
Do you want me to repeat that? No, with the microphone. So if you have, like you want to do, you want the income to go to the church general fund, can you just do a fundraiser and call it donations? And like we're doing a cups of coffee,
Right.
donations $1, and 100% of that goes to the general fund. Is that-
Absolutely. So what I'm talking about here are specific businesses that actually end up getting set up in churches, right? I'll differentiate those here in just a second. So it's taxable if it constitutes a trade or business, if it's regularly carried on and it is not substantially related. Okay, what that means by substantially related is that it's unique to the ministry. Something that's unique to the ministry that you can't go get on the corner, you can't go get somewhere else, that changes it. But a bookstore, well, there's Barnes and Noble, right? So it's not substantially related. A restaurant or a coffee shop, there's a coffee shop down the street. There's all these other coffee shops. So that's their kind of differentiation between those. And the fact that the income is for ministry use does not necessarily mean that it's tax exempt. Okay? Again, we're talking about the bookstore. So let me give you the exemptions that go with this. You must only meet one of these. The other ones you have to meet all three. This one you only have to meet one. Substantially all the work in operating the business is done by volunteers. Now you can have a bookstore, a coffee shop, nobody gets paid. Now that's just for the church, right? The business is conducted primarily for the purpose of its members. So you have a bookstore here, but you're not open during the week. You're not open during the day. XYZ from another church can't come in here and buy a book. They can only come in during church time, right? So, and then number 3, the business involves selling merchandise that was donated. So here again, I come in and I say, here, I want to give you 3 coffee pots. I'm going to give you all this coffee. I just want you to give it and put a cup there, and anything that comes in, I want it to go to the youth ministry. Nothing wrong with that whatsoever. So I'm really talking about major business decisions. Again, a church buying a whole property and leasing out half of it, to benefit them. That's unrelated business income tax. Again, the bookstore. Okay, any questions on 501c3 and unrelated business income tax before we go on? And
I know we've been talking about income tax. Where does property taxes fit in with all this?
so, if you own a building or if you're leasing a building, so our building sits on 3 acres in Valencia County, and churches can be exempt from property taxes if you go into the assessor's office and show them they have some documents they want to see, that it's in the church's name, some of the bylaws. So our bylaws say that nobody can benefit. Let's say the church decided to close, we decided to shut it down, and then I sell the property for $1 million. I don't get the $1 million. The bylaws say it has to go back into ministry. I'll give you a good example. Pastor John Hill, a really good friend of mine, used to run the Albuquerque Rescue Mission that then became Steel Bridge. Pastor Hill's 72 years old. He also has a church right off of Broadway and Gibson. And he got to the point where I can't run Steel Bridge anymore. So he talked to several pastors and groups, and Legacy came to him and said, "Hey, we'd like to take this over. We'd like to run it. Here's our vision for it." He just signed the whole thing over. He did not get a dime for it, and they got whatever debt there was. They got everything that was existing just went to them, right? And so ministries that are set up well would do that, right? It's not for the benefit of a person. I'm the 5th pastor of the church that I'm at right now. My dad was the original pastor. There was 3 in between him and I, and he set it up that way that nobody can benefit from that. It's for the ministry. He lived very meagerly at all of my life as a pastor, right? And so I didn't answer your question, but that church property is all taxed in. We don't pay any taxes on property. Now, we have a piece of property that my mom and I own on the church property that we bought from the church initially for them to live on. And so my mom is getting up there, and so when she passes at some point, we will sell at a very, very good price to the church that piece of property, and then it'll become a caretaker or some piece. Right now we pay taxes on that because it's owned by us personally. But as soon as it becomes in the church's name, then those property taxes will go away as well. Leases, I don't know. You don't. I think the lease, triple net. Right. To be charged. Yeah. So if you're not the owner, so Pastor Scott, in essence, the church is paying a portion of the property taxes, but it's rolled in as part of the lease under other things, right? So, and he can't get exemption because there's a church here, because he's not the church. So, that answer that question? Somebody else had a question. Yes, sir.
On the UBET,
Yes.
let's say you see it has to be primarily run by volunteers to kind of
One way to get the exemption.
one way. What if a pastor who's being paid is overseeing the ministry? I guess that would be really hard to prove. Does that change anything?
Well, but
If
the pastor's
primary-
main responsibility isn't to work in the bookstore or the coffee shop. And I think that, a good example, and I don't think Pastor Scott will mind, when he was early on in ministry in California, he was hired on to be the bookstore manager, right? So he got paid a salary and everything, but then he also had pastoral duties, right? So that was a paid position. He was full-time in the bookstore, but he also had other duties. And so, again, I don't know how they did all their accounting, but that's how that would apply. So again, it's generally something to be aware of, and in most cases, even in coffee shops and bookstores really don't make any money when it's just for the church people, because there's just not enough business, right? And so, and in most cases, they are run by volunteers during the church service. And if you're open full time, Calvary Albuquerque has a bookstore that's open full time, and you'll pay sales tax when you go in there. You'll pay all. They're not exempt from all of those things, and so they run it as a separate entity. You guys want to take a break right now? It's 8 o'clock, or what time do you take a break? 8 what? 8:30? Okay. All right, we'll hit this one pretty quick. Accounting, whatever ministry you have, for accountability and credibility, you want to do good accounting, right? And I try to make it pretty simple. So what we're going to talk about is integrity, transparency, accountability, proper record keeping, contribution records, and year-end letters. Okay. So I referenced 1 Corinthians chapter 14, and as you guys know, that's all about the gifts and the use, and Paul talks about tongues in church and just order in church, and he ends the chapter with, let all things be done decently in order. And I include that in here because the word all means, in the Greek, all things, right? So how you conduct yourself in church, how you conduct yourself in the office, how you conduct yourself has to be done decently in order. And this is where I personally, helping other churches, see a lot of churches get a little bit in trouble, not with anybody in particular, but they kind of lose control because they haven't done a really good job with the accounting part. Integrity is a biblical mandate, and if I know Pastor Scott, he has talked to you and talked to you and talked to you about the importance of integrity. It's what Jesus requires of us. It's how we should be as a Christian. It's how we should be in the church. It's how we should be in everything. We should be people of integrity. And I have always said integrity is something that no one can take from you. It's the only thing that no one can take from you, but you can give it away, right? Another friend of mine always says, we're one decision away from doing something stupid. All the time, we're one decision away from doing something stupid. And Satan's always right there saying, you really don't need to get a permit. Oh, you really don't need to do this. You're a church, you mean well, you can just do these things, right? But we want to do them right. We want to do things decently in order. And where we can, we want to obey the laws of the land. So again, integrity can be thrown away, but no one can take it from you. And I will tell you that you will always be remembered by the last stupid thing that you've done, right? It doesn't matter, and we all can name a pastor somewhere that was in ministry for years and years and years, did great work, but then he did something really stupid. And it gets publicized, and we know about it, and it brings reproach to the gospel and all of those things, right? And so it's so important to do everything decently and in order. Transparency. Webster defines it as something to see through. I say it's living in a glass house. And we should, as Christians, live in a glass house, right? We should be able to be who we are. They should be able to see through us and see Christ in us and see that we're doing things according to the Word of God and the will of God. And so everything in our life and in our church must be done with transparency. That doesn't mean that anybody that walks in and says, well, what's the income of the church and how are you spending your money? That you show them that, right? But you want to have accountability, you want to have transparency. And, at least a couple times a year, I talk about, in a message, something about thanking people for their gifts and their tithes and offerings and how it blesses the church. And here's some of the things that we've been able to do in ministry and outreach and doing things for other people. And so you celebrate those things and you share. You will find as you get into ministry that there are some people that just want to cause problems, right? So they want to know, well, why did you spend money on that? Well, where did the money come from for those pictures? And why didn't you get and how much was all that? And you have to be aware of those kinds of things. But I can guarantee you all of us could lay out our checkbooks today and examine one another, and we go, I don't know that I would agree with how he spent that money, and you may not agree with how I spent that money, but is it a sin, right? Is it something that would displease the Lord? And so just talking about transparency and accountability, right? When we talk about accountability, there's things that you need to seek counsel from others. Major decisions, leasing a building. That's why having elders or a board other good, solid Christian men that you can talk to and get counsel from that are going to give you counsel from the Word of God. You know what? My opinion doesn't matter. I'm sorry, your opinion doesn't matter. What matters is what does God say, and you want people around you that are going to lead you to what does God say, and how does that apply in this situation. It also gives you some oversight on major decisions and purchases. Um, I have a couple elders at our church, and so when we want to start giving to a new ministry or something like that, we get together and say, "Hey, God's really put it on my heart that we want to give a monthly donation to this. You guys see any concerns? What do you feel about this ministry? Whatever." And we talk about those things. So having oversight over major purchases, an accountant, a board, elders. And again, beware of troublemakers. There's always going to be somebody that doesn't like the way you did it, how you did it, where did the money come from, and those kinds of things. Years ago, I had a couple come up to me and they said, "Well, we want to see the church books. You always say that anybody that, that they're open." I said, "Yeah, they are." "So why do you want to see the church books?" "Well, it's like, I can already tell you have something you're looking for, and so nothing is going to make you happy. And you're just looking for, they were already had a foot out the door and they were just wanting to stir up trouble." And I said, "Sorry." Record keeping. You have to keep records on certain things. Back up. All contributions have to be recorded. All contributions have to be recorded. Not some, not only checks, everything has to be recorded. I'll tell you how to do that in a minute. All income. In a church, all income is contributions. There's really no other, right? You're not selling anything, you're not doing anything, you're not manufacturing anything. But any income that comes in has to be recorded. I'll give you an example of that, stupid example, but we were on the PNM program where they could cut off our air conditioner anytime we wanted. And they paid us $25 a year to do that, right? So that's other income. It wasn't a contribution, it was something that they did for appreciation. But then when they cut it off on Wednesday night and everybody was sweating, we got out of the program. So it wasn't worth the 25 bucks. All expenses need to be recorded. And generally that can be done right in your checkbook, but you want to keep the receipts, right? So if you have a church and have a building, you're going to automatically have an electric bill, a water bill, a gas bill, an insurance bill, which we'll talk about. Payroll, when you get to that point, has to be done properly, and payroll liabilities have to be done. And we'll talk about that a little bit after you have something to eat and are a little more sleepy. So again, when initially I do, and even today, do everything with Excel spreadsheets. I really only have three. I have our bank transaction register, I have an income expense report, and then I have the contributions register. All of that is done on Excel spreadsheets, and it works very well. Large churches, I would recommend QuickBooks Nonprofit Edition. It does all of that, but again, starting out small, why spend the $250, $500? Some of them even have now anymore. It's all in the cloud, and you pay a monthly fee. And pretty soon, all of the monthly fees start adding up to a lot. So again, I can help you with all that when the time comes. So talking about contributions, all contributions by givers, you have to have their last name, first name, both if married, address, city, state, and zip code. All contributions from January 1 through December 31st have to be listed, and contribution letters sent to every contributor by the end of January 31. So if you've been donating to any nonprofit, you have been getting receipts in the mail this last month of here's how much you gave to this one, here's how much you gave here, here's how much you gave here. And you have to have those to file your income taxes. Contribution letters should always have this statement on the bottom of it. No products or services were given in exchange for these contributions. So they know that, hey, they didn't get any benefit for giving their contribution. It was just free will giving out of the goodness of their heart. So this is an example of one of the spreadsheets that I use. And again, this was for a church years ago that I was helping in Placerville. Up in the top corner, it had records from which date to which date. And then, which is wrong, by the way, but every time they gave a donation, we listed the date, whether it was cash, credit card, or a check. Was it a regular contribution? Did it go in the general fund, and how much was it? And as you do those every week, as your income comes in, at the end of the year, they're already done. And at the bottom, there was a place for the signature of the administrator, and it said no goods or services were provided in exchange for these contributions. And so it's very, very simple to keep that record, but you have to keep a good record, and it must balance with your checkbook all the time. Talk about restricted contributions. Restricted contributions are contributions that you say, we are going to raise money for a building fund. We're going to raise money for giving to disaster relief in Haiti. We're going to raise money for missionary support of this XYZ missionary. People in the congregation do not get to decide where the money goes that they give to the church. It's funny how that happens sometimes, is they'll write a check to the church and they'll write on the bottom, well, I want this to go to parking lot repaving because they don't like the pothole where they park every week, right? You don't have to give it there unless the pastor gets up and says, we need to repave the parking lot. It's going to cost $100,000. If you'd like to give specifically to the parking lot repaving, mark that on your check. Now that's restricted contribution. But it's only when the pastor or church leadership gets up and says, we're going to do a special gift for this purpose. You don't get to decide what that is. The church decides what it is. And the thing about it is, you just add it on onto their report, just like any other contribution. But it cannot be used for any other purpose. So if I, as the pastor, get up and say, hey, we need $100,000 to repave the parking lot, put that on your check. What happens if I get $110,000? I have to tell people, one, stop giving to the pavement. We have too much money. And then I have to ask them, hey, we have $10,000 extra. If you want some money back, we have to give it back to them, or we can transfer it to somewhere else. Generally, they'll say, oh, yeah, just use it wherever, right? But restricted contributions have to be used for the purpose in which they were given. Gifts in kind are non-cash gifts, donation of items, donation of services. A car, somebody says, hey, I want to give you this car, and you can use it for whatever you want. You can sell it or do whatever. You do not add that to the individual's contribution report, but you generate a letter of thanks, list the item or service they've provided, and advise them to have their accountant establish the value. You don't ever want to get caught in establishing the value, because they always think what they're giving you is way worth more than what it really is, right? Why would they give you a $10,000 car if they could sell it for $10,000 when it's really only worth $5,000, right? So you want to put that on their accountant and them to establish the value. So that's gifts in kind, and we'll stop there on, that's kind of where we're at on accounting. Any questions on that? Yes, sir.
Can you explain that again about the them determining the value?
Sure. So if you're in ministry, and it's interesting how much people want to give you, it's easier to give you their stuff than take it to Goodwill themselves. But I digress. Um, Cars are a good example. And occasionally at the church I was at, somebody would just want to give us a car for whatever reason. They just, hey, I have this car. I don't know if the church can use it. Maybe you know somebody in the church that needs a car and you can give it to them. I would write them a letter and say, thank you, Mr. So-and-so and Miss So-and-so for the donation of your your 2020, Ford Grand Prix, whatever it was. I'd list what it was. And, this will greatly enhance our ministry and we appreciate your donation. Please contact your accountant to value your donation. I don't want to get caught in overvaluing something. That's between their conscience, the Lord, and the IRS, not me, right? I don't, if they come and say, hey, this car I'm giving you is worth $10,000, and I go to Kelley Blue Book and look it up and it's worth $5, now what am I doing, right? Where's my integrity? Oh, I want the car, so I'm going to tell them it's worth $15,000 when it's not worth $15,000. So you put it back on them, right?
Now, are you held accountable to what they say that it's worth
Because
as
that's
income, as a increase?
as a donation.
Yeah.
So all donations are between you, your tax man, and the IRS.
Now, how about your books?
My books are fine because I'm not valuing it at all. I'm not taking it in as income and I'm not spending it as income.
Because it's tax-free,
Correct.
exempt automatically,
Correct.
whether you're 501.
If you give this church a
not.
car and then Pastor Scott sells the car, it's for the ministry. It's like they gave a tithe.
You just
Dave?
answered it. No, thank you.
Right. So maybe their accountant says, yeah, the car's worth $5,000. Pastor Scott sells it for $3,000. Everybody's good. Because their accountant agreed with them that that's what it was worth. If you're not a person of integrity, you can fill out your IRS form and say you gave, $100,000 in donations this year when you only gave 20,000, right? Because you don't send any of those receipts in. It's just what you communicate to your accountant, and that's called what? Fraud, right? So you can either be a person of integrity or you could commit fraud. That's entirely up to you. And the Lord. Right, right. I'm going to tell you what the law says of what you're supposed to do and the right way to do it. How you choose to do it is up to you. Right? That's between you and the Lord. Right? I'm going to tell you how I'm going to do it because I want to stand before the Lord and go, I accounted for every penny, didn't take a dime. It's all accounted for. Pastor Scott. Good question. And the reason we don't do that is because there is a cost associated with doing that dinner. So the IRS does say that you can deduct the difference of the fair market value versus what you paid. So let's say we're going to have a Valentine's dinner in 2 weeks or a week, and it's $40 per person or $80 per couple. And you're going to get a steak dinner and you're going to get dessert and we're going to have some entertainment and some worship and a teaching and all of those things. Well, you can legally count that if your steak dinner was really $25, the difference between 25 and 40 is really considered a contribution. You know, we as a church don't go to that level and put that on their tithing report, because again, it's a non-cash. I mean, they did receive a benefit for that. It goes back to that statement on there. No benefits were received for these contributions. A Valentine's dinner, you received a benefit. You got a dinner. You got entertainment. You got certain things. You got a gift on your table. So you did get a benefit. So it can't go on your statement. And you can personally argue with you keep your receipts or whatever, and you can tell your accountant, hey, we have $15 extra for my wife and I, for the difference of what it was. And that's legal to do. But we're not going to put it on your statement. Does that answer your question? Any other questions? Yes, sir. No, sir. It's free to get, and you never have to pay for it. There's nothing. It's like the mark of the beast. It's just a way for them to track you. But that does set, and you know what? You can go on the state commission website, and you can Google churches and stuff, and you can see who's incorporated, who's done what. I mean, our church will show up. This church will show up. And there is a list you can look on the IRS, and there's just literally, because there's hundreds of thousands of nonprofits in the United States, so you can find yourself on the list if you were diligent enough to look.
I got a question. People are not using radio stations much anymore, and they're establishing a YouTube account to where they do part of their ministry on that. And I know that YouTube, after so many amount of likes or subscribers or something, starts paying you.
Okay.
How would you account for that on your taxes?
So, as the church, or you personally? It's church ministry, just put it back in the church fund. Yeah. So we broadcast every Sunday and Wednesday night on Facebook Live, and then that automatically, then we actually upload that to YouTube as well, and then it ends up on our church website. No one's ever paid us anything yet for it, but if it does, we would just put that money back. Just like the $25 from PNM, we just put it back in the general fund. Oh, going back to accounting for contributions. So you'll have one for every person. So you'll have one of those sheets, and I just use one spreadsheet. And if you're a spreadsheet guy, you can put tabs at the bottom, and I just start listing them alphabetically. So if somebody comes to church mid-year, I just create a new tab, put the form on there, and start recording their tithes. And then I have it all going to a final page that summarizes it all, so it stays all in balance. But there is one you have to have. It's called non-cash or anonymous contributions. And that is when somebody drops a 20 in the offering plate, they don't put their name on it, you don't know who it is, you list it on the non-cash, and that way they all balance. So at the end of the year, if you had $10,000 come in and you add up all the people that gave and the non-cash, it should equal that same amount. Make sense? So, and in that non-cash is kind of where we put all those P&M things like if a check came in that really isn't a contribution, I mean, I'm not going to send YouTube a receipt saying thank you for your contribution, right? That's just going to be a non-cash or an unknown contribution. Okay. All right, I think your food is, hey, well, we're right on time, 8:30, so head back there and grab some food, and we'll wrap it up after. this that I think are important. So we were talking about bookstores and other things that are possible business. One way you could do that, let's say God blesses you and your ministry grows and you want to have a full-time bookstore and open up to the public and do all those things. You can just get a separate EIN number and run that as a separate sub-business to your church and pay the employees, pay rent, pay all those things, and any profits that are left, you just donate them to the church. But that will be a tax-deductible entity. Okay, that will not be a nonprofit. It's not a house of worship, and you can't get a 501c3 for a restaurant or a bookstore. So that's one way to do that. The other thing in this tax guide for churches, and a couple things about that. Josh, right, in the back? Josh has the presentation I'm giving, and he has a copy of this 501c3 document. We're happy to give it all to you. So if you want copies of it, you can either email me, which I'll give you at the end, and I'll send them to you, or they have them here at the church. You guys can just feel free to give them out and let people use them, whatever you want. So should have told you that up front so you're not blistering your fingers trying to take notes. The other thing I wanted to mention about this tax guide for churches, in 2015, they rewrote the book, and they put a ton of stuff in here about politics. Their attempt to really keep churches from making political statements and political pushes for candidates and things like that. There's a lot of stuff in here. And you need to be aware of it because it doesn't say you can't talk about politics. It doesn't say you can't have a candidate come and speak in your church. It doesn't say, what it does say is as a pastor, I am not supposed to get up in front of the church and say, I think you should vote for this person and not for this person, right? But I could go to their campaign headquarters and I could stand in front of everybody and say, you should really vote for this person, right? Because I'm not now speaking to the church, I'm speaking outside of the church, and it's my opinion, right? And so my answer to all that is, and what I choose to do in our church is disciple people. And if you're discipling people, you're teaching them God's word. And everything about God's word is helping us to live our lives by looking through the lens of Scripture. It's called a what? Biblical worldview, right? And if we teach people to have a biblical worldview, then it's really easy to say, it's important in this next election that you get out and vote and you exercise your right as a citizen to vote. And how are you going to vote? You're going to use the Bible as your guide. What does this candidate stand for that's scriptural that we stand for as Christians? It's not about my personal thing about getting a stimulus or the economy or whatever. I'm going to vote for somebody who's pro-life because I'm pro-life. God's pro-life, right? So if you teach people to have a biblical worldview, then you encourage them to vote according to Scripture, and you're not violating anything, and you can have a lot of freedom in doing that. So, yeah, just don't be afraid. You'll read all that stuff, and you'll go, oh, my goodness, I can't say anything. You can, right? You just have to be careful what you say. And again, my main purpose as a pastor is not to get people to vote for a candidate. It's to get them to love Jesus, right? And get them in God's word and get them to be disciples of Christ. And so that's how I address that. This next section is on human resources. Again, at the beginning I said churches are not a business, but they have a business aspect to them. And whatever God calls you to do, maybe assistant pastor or maybe a senior pastor, and maybe over time you have a church and people coming, and now you need an assistant pastor and maybe a second assistant pastor, maybe a youth leader, maybe a children's ministry leader, and these are all paid positions. So you have to deal with that, right? And so it's interesting, and I say this to myself a lot of times, man, all I want to do is disciple people, but you know what? I still got to pay the electric bill. You know, all I want to do is disciple and teach God's word, but oh, I've got to deal with insurance. You know, you still have all of those business aspects that you have to talk about and deal with. So in this section, we're going to talk about pastors' compensation, exemptions for pastors, housing allowance, employee compensation for non-pastors. Going to talk about payroll taxes, health insurance, and an employee manual. And you're going, man, I haven't even started my ministry and I don't want to talk about an employee manual, right? So I'm just going to give you the highlights so you know what you have to deal with when you get there. And again, you may be called to be in an administrative or support role in your church, and you need to know these things so that we're doing the things the proper way. Pastor's compensation is a very, very unique thing in churches. The IRS considers pastors as dual status employees. It is one of the dumbest things I've come across, but, well, not from the IRS. Sorry, I didn't advance the screen there. A dual status employee. What does that mean? It means they are employees for federal income tax purposes, and they're self-employed for Social Security and Medicare purposes. So the church can take out federal income tax out of their check, but they are self-employed for Social Security and Medicare. The church cannot withhold Social Security and Medicare. All of you that have jobs right now, what happens? You know, the self-employment Medicare tax is 15.3% of your income. Your employer pays half, you pay half. So when you get your paycheck, they take out 7.65% combined for Social Security and Medicare. And your employer pays the other half. In a church, you can't do that for pastors because we're considered self-employed in our pastoral role. So I have to personally pay, if I get paid, I have to pay 15.3% out of my check to and put it in a fund, either put it in a checking account so I can pay it at the end of the year, or they really want you to pay it quarterly. So that's paid. But federal income tax can be taken out of the check. There's two ways to deal with that. And one is to have an additional 15.3 of your gross pay taken out as federal income tax. So let's say you're having 10% taken out as federal, then have them take 25% out as federal income tax. That's a big number. But when you file your taxes, have this amount moved from federal income tax to SECA, which is self-employment tax, on your annual tax return. And I capitalize, do not take it as a refund. Hard lesson on that, not because of me, but I had to deal with it. A pastor I was serving with, the person before him was doing exactly this. Their administrator was doing this, but didn't tell the pastor that that's how it was doing. So he went and filed his income tax. He got a boatload of tax back that year. He was like, whoa, this is great. The next year, did the same thing. And I come along and start researching that, and I said, here's how we have to deal with that. He goes, oh, well, yeah, I think that's how I've been dealing with it. But instead of having his accountant move it from federal income tax to self-employment tax, he was taking it as a refund. Ended up having to pay a large sum of money back to the IRS. So you don't want to do that, okay? So just be aware of that. The other thing you can do is file an IRS 4361 exemption. And what that does is in ministry, you have the right to be a conscientious objector. And you can say, I don't want the government to take care of me, so I don't want to pay Social Security and Medicare. And you file this form, IRS 4361, you get it on the IRS website. You send it in. It must be done within 2 years of being ordained. Okay, so once you're ordained in ministry, you have 2 years to decide, well, hey, do I want to be paying this 15% to the government all the time? And if you don't, then you file this form Um, you send it in, they receive it, they send you back a letter saying you are about to exempt yourself from Social Security and Medicare. Are you sure you want to do that? You have 90 days to respond, and we're not going to grant it for 90 days. So the 90-day cool off, change your mind period, basically. And once they grant you that exemption, it only applies to ministry. So some 18 years ago, I did that when I was first ordained in ministry. So during those times in ministry, I wasn't paying into the Social Security system. Now, I had all my quarters and everything before from working in the corporate world, and I have been working, I currently have a full-time job, and so I'm not exempt at my current employer. I'm paying plenty of Social Security, but in ministry now, I don't have to pay it if I don't want to. So you can exempt yourself out of it. And the form just says, basically a simple one-page form, I don't rely on the government to take care of me. So if that's not you, then you can't sign that form. So that's one way to get out of paying that. So very confusing with how pastors get paid. Many churches do it wrong. They just pay them just like another employee, and legally not the way it's supposed to be done. Housing allowance is, however, a wonderful benefit that you get as a pastor. So pastors can receive non-taxed income to maintain housing. It is one of the best benefits that the IRS gives for pastors. How it works is it's board approved. It's an amount based on your request, and it includes mortgage, rent, taxes, insurance, utilities, furnishings, maintenance, upgrades, etc. It is a very liberal, if I could use that word, I don't like the word liberal, but it's a very liberal policy. So as a pastor, and what we would generally do is have a form at the beginning of the year. We'd have a meeting, and every pastor would be given this form and say, hey, we want to know what your housing allowance is. And you justify it by, how much rent or mortgage, your utilities, you add all that up and you know what it is, and you turn that in. And then when they got paid, a certain amount was housing allowance, then the rest was salary. And this amount is non-taxed income, federally non-taxed. It still is subject to Social Security and Medicare, but if you exempt out, then it's completely exempt. So when I talk about liberal, it includes everything you think you will spend. It is a preset amount, and you cannot change it mid-year. So you can't all of a sudden realize, oh, I'm going to need a new roof this year. I should have put that in. Legally, you can't do that. You have to wait till the next year. You can only get to claim the preset amount. So you can't change it mid-year or any time just because some new thing came along. If you spend more, you lose the benefit of the difference. And I'm going to explain all that to you here in just a second. So, how it works. Again, if you underspend, you have to pay the taxes on the difference, right? So, you don't have to pay self-employment tax on housing unless you do have to pay it unless you're exempt. I already mentioned that. So let's talk about you have a base on a $24,000 a year salary. I also want you to remember that pastors are highly paid individuals, right? So you're choosing to go into something that is in the top class of pay in the United States of America. So based on a $24,000 a year salary, you calculate your housing expense and you get board approval. So let's say it's going to cost you $18,000 a year to maintain your house. And again, that's your rent, your utilities. Your wife wants to buy new drapes. You need a new couch. You're going to put a new set of dishes. All of those things are included. That's why I say it's one of the most liberal things the IRS does. So on a basis of $24,000, 18,000 is housing and it's non-tax. So you're really only paying tax on $6,000 a year. Now I'm talking federal income tax. What a great benefit. It's great for the church and it's great for you personally. So, but let's say you put in for $18,000, but you only spent $15,000 because you have to do an accounting at the end of the year. How much did I really spend that's in housing? It's really easy. Just take a folder and you put housing on it. Every receipt, everything goes in there, all of your utility bills, all of that. You add it up at the end of the year and go, man, I only spent $15,000. Well, that unspent $3,000 does become taxable. And it's all done when you file your income tax, right? It's an excellent benefit. And I would encourage everybody when your church or whatever your ministry is, whenever you can take income, take it as housing allowance first. Because it's tax deductible. It's you don't have to pay tax on it. Always overestimate. It's better to pay tax on the difference than to go over and not be able to claim it. So in my example, we didn't spend $18,000, so we had to pay tax on the difference, right? Because that was income to us. I always throw in things you think you might have to do. Hey, maybe this year we'll change the hot water heater. There's another $2,000. You add it up because if you don't hit the number, it's okay. But if you go over the number, you don't get to claim the difference. So if you're claiming 18 and you spend 24,000, you didn't get the benefit of $6,000. So always go over the amount when you're figuring it out. So that's it on housing allowance. It's a really a great benefit. And again, I know you guys aren't at that place yet, but that's the things to be aware of in your churches. And anybody that's an ordained pastor follows those rules. Okay. The administrative assistant, the bookstore manager, any of those, unless you call them a pastor, they can't be paid like a pastor or have housing allowance. Which gets us to every other employee. If you have a secretary, on-staff accountant, you have a bookstore manager, you have a youth leader that you don't call a pastor, you have a children's ministry leader that you don't call a pastor, you pay them just like everybody else in any other job. You take out taxes, the church pays for half of their Social Security and Medicare, and they have the deduction for the others, just like any other employee, any other place. Again, the church is required to pay the other 50% of Social Security and Medicare, and you are required to give employees W-2 forms at the end of the year, and you're paying taxes on a quarterly or monthly or even weekly basis. Anybody really in the church that's receiving income should really be a W-2 employee, right? Even if you're just paying them for a day a week. The 1099 only applies if you're under $600 a year. So if you're going to give somebody under $600 a year, so it's $599, then you can give them a 1099. Right? So the IRS sets guidelines on how often you need to pay quarterly, monthly, or every 3 days on payroll. So if your church has a lot of employees and it's all set by dollar amounts, if you have so many tax dollars a month, they determine, do you pay quarterly, do you pay monthly, or do you pay 3 days after your pay period, right? So large companies today, when payroll comes out on whatever day it comes out, within 3 days, they're sending the government the money. of what they took out of your check and their other half, right? So that's just, and there are guidelines on how to do it. You know, one or two employees, you're going to pay quarterly, and it's done through a 941 form, and you send that in quarterly, and it has to match your monthly payments that you send in. Payroll taxes these days are all paid online. There's a website that you go and set up, and you put in there how much was federal income tax, how much was this, how much was that, and you send it in. Again, you're only sending in your half that you have to pay. And again, you have to file a quarterly 941 that balances all that, and then you have to file annual W-2s and W-3s. And when you start getting into that, it's like takes the real fun out of ministry, right? Right? Just want to preach. So that's how payroll works. Churches are exempt from federal unemployment tax. Therefore, no church employee can claim unemployment. So you have a pastor and he does something really stupid, one decision away from doing something stupid, and you have to let him go. Say, sorry, this doesn't fit with ministry. You need to go back to the corporate world and work. He can't go file unemployment because we're exempt from that. State income tax is not required, but should be done when you have non-pastor employees. So for a while, we did have one administrative person at the church I'm at now, and we didn't take federal income tax, we didn't take state income tax. All we paid was their Social Security and their Medicare, and they paid their half as well. When you start having employees, man, you have to consider health insurance, which is expensive. Workers' compensation insurance. All those you purchase from an independent insurance company. You pay a quarterly fee on your return in the state. It's like $2.30 a person every quarter that you have on your payroll. Employee handbooks. I mean, that's like way down the road. If you have, again, a large church, lots of employees, now you have to tell them, hey, here's how we're going to discipline. Here's what holidays you're going to have. Here's what hours we work. Here's all of those same kind of things. You would think in a church it's really easy because everybody just loves Jesus and we just want to come and serve and nobody's going to get upset and nobody's going to complain and everything's going to go okay until you have two pastors in the back room going fisticuffs, right? They're just going at it over something, right? Well, how are you going to deal with that? And it does happen, unfortunately. So, back up here. Facilities, we'll just talk about that for a minute. When a home church, you don't have to worry about it. And if you have a home church, you still get to claim all the housing allowances, for your church. When you start getting into facilities, man, it's like, are you going to buy a place? Are you going to lease a place? There's building leases. There's tenant improvements. So this church is in a leased facility right now. So everything that you see that's been done here is done by a tenant improvement. Sometimes you can negotiate the landlord to put in some money for tenant improvements and spread it out over the life of the lease. It means you pay more, or you pay the lease and you do the tenant improvements. Either way, you're going to spend the money. So those are all things to consider. Building construction is a big deal. Permits, licensing, all the things that go into that. Liability insurance, absolutely important, just because we're in such a litigious society, right? Somebody walks out, slips on some ice, falls and breaks a hip, they want the church to pay for it. Something happens, kids playing out on the swing set in the playground, breaks an arm, they want the church to pay for that. It happened at church. Somebody needs to pay for my things, okay? So liability insurance can be expensive. We pay about $1,600 a quarter for liability insurance. So it gets pretty, and there's certain things they want you to cover, and especially when you start getting into children's ministries and youth ministries, and you have to insure for sexual misconduct, right? So what happens if the youth leader inappropriately touches one of the youth? What happens if a youth inappropriately touches a youth? What happens in your somebody's daughter gets pregnant in in one of the rooms, or I mean, there's all kinds of things, and you think I'm crazy. These things happen, right? And so you need to be protected and insured for those kinds of things. And certainly there's maintenance, it costs, utilities costs. Those are all fixed incomes of being in a building. So in building leases, there's terms, there's conditions for lease and termination. Cost per square foot, things we call triple net, maintenance, roof, heating and air conditioning units, certain things that go into that, taxes. And so, a lot to consider when going into a building. Again, I mentioned tenant improvements, renewal options. Are you going to say, okay, we're going to lease for 5 years with the option for 2 more 5-year periods? Are we planning on being here for 15 years? Usually at the end of each lease term, there's negotiation that starts all over again because they want more money. You don't want to pay more money. And it's interesting in society today because of COVID, my cleaners went out of business. Half the restaurants where I live have gone out of business. And some of them have said, well, because my landlord wouldn't even work with me. I don't have any money to pay rent, and yet my landlord wouldn't work with me, right? And then I have another friend in the restaurant business, and he says, man, my landlord came to me from the get-go and says, hey, we're going to help you. We want to cut your lease by this amount for this period of time. And what do you need? He goes, well, I need a patio. So he said, okay, I'll pay for the patio, and we'll just add that amount into your lease when we start going back to 100% for 1 year. That's really cool. So, and again, renewal options, fire insurance, all of those things are important in building leases and liability insurance. I'm surprised a lot of times churches do things and think they don't have to get a permit. Well, we're just a church, we want to, and I'm just, doing all this building, and then the inspector comes along and says, hey, well, you guys are building, and where's your permit? Oh, I didn't think I needed a permit. Oh, okay, well, here's your permit and your fine. So keep on going, right? And you have to meet all local and state codes. And so that kind of brings us to the end. That's my email. If you have any questions or ever get to a point where, and Pastor Scott has it, and he knows he can give it to anybody. I won't make excuses, but I have a full-time job and a full-time ministry and a family. So if I don't get back to you immediately, don't fret. I will get back to you. So happy to help, happy to answer any questions. And again, they have the copy of the tax guide for churches if you want it. They also have a copy of this presentation. Feel free to use it and give it wherever you want, but change the email address if you give it. Any other questions? Anything about anything? Well, that wasn't my intent, is to keep you from. There's a saying we use a lot: where God guides, God provides, right? And it sounds really complicated, but if you just take those first steps, which are really easy, get your EIN number, get a bank account, start church. And then as those things come along, you just slowly add to them. Okay, now we need to get incorporated. We need to do this. We need to do that.
So much of what we've done has been just that, just jump in, start doing, start preaching, start winning souls. So guilty of not having true bylaws, guilty of not having consistent meetings. Wondering how much of that is something I need to do like today.
So I'm going to tell you the truth. The IRS, we are all so small, they're never going to come and see us. Like I say, I've been involved in the church I'm at now for 44 years. Never. We got a couple letters from the IRS when my dad was not paying some things right and transposed some numbers on some forms. And I'm going to be honest with you, I've helped several churches who've gotten in trouble with their taxes and not filing their forms correctly and getting letters saying you owe this much and there's this penalty. I have called the IRS numerous times, and every time, and I even helped a 501c7 instead of a C3, a swim team, sports team, right? That can be not that got in trouble, and I have had great success with them working with me over the phone and clearing things up. So don't panic if you haven't been doing everything right. Just start doing everything right, and it's just little things, here and there. I think if you meet with your board and elders at least once a year, officially, this is an official meeting where, take some notes. On this date, we all met. Here's the things we discussed. We went over the finances of the church. We went over this. We went over that. Here's some things we want to do. Pastor so-and-so made a motion to do this. We all agreed. You can follow Robert's Rules of Orders pretty easy. They're not hard to do. Housing allowances and things like that. Just, I probably have a form somewhere you could use. It's basically, it gives you all the things, your mortgage, your utilities, furnishings, all that you fill out and say, okay, this is what I want to use every year. So again, I say we want to do everything right, decently and in order, and we want to have it with integrity. God's a God of grace, right? And so you're going to make some mistakes. You're going to, my dad, I'll just say, he paid himself wrong as a pastor for many, many years. He was doing the whole everything. And, a year from retirement wasn't the time for me to go in and go, hey, gee, Dad, you've been doing this thing all wrong. And we've got to go back and fix all this. It's like we just kept doing it for a year and said, look, we're not going to. We didn't cheat anybody out of anything. The government all got their money. It just wasn't done exactly the way that they would like us to do it.
On. I always wondered how pastors got paid. And, I knew it had something to do with tithing. When a pastor comes on board, starting with, let's say he's starting a church, period. He's not coming onto an existing church, and so how do you determine what your salary is? How does that whole thing work? Is there a standard for that, or even if he comes into an established church, if tithes are down, do they not get paid? I'm just curious.
I can tell you personally, my dad starting a church over many years, he was bivocational. He would set up mobile homes by day, and he would come home and study every night, and he would teach on Wednesday night. There was times he would show up at home at 6:30, jump in the shower, didn't eat, and went and taught that night, and never got paid for years. And then when the church, it was all about what income was coming in, and when the church was able to start paying him, he would get a salary. He retired maybe 10 years ago. Well, like I said, I'm the fifth pastor. One of his elders took over, and that didn't last very long. And then another one took over, and then there was a pastor there for 5 years that just recently left about a year ago. And I can say in about 35 years, I don't think my dad ever made more than $2,000 a month. Yet they were so blessed. But that's all the church could do, right? And so if you're going into an existing church and maybe the budget's good and everything, and the pastor that was just there was making, I'm just going to throw out numbers, 40,000 a year, and maybe they say, well, this is what we can afford to pay you, right? And then you have to decide, no, that's all in, okay? So when I talk about housing allowance, let's say the church is going to pay you 40,000 a year, and you want 25,000 in housing allowance. So 15,000 is going to be taxable, and 25,000 is going to be non-taxable for federal income tax. What's that? Gasoline and car maintenance and all those other things. Because your home insurance and all, you can claim all of that in your housing allowance, but it's still an expense you have to pay. I mean, it doesn't mean that, if your household needs 50,000 a year and the church is going to pay you 40 all in, what's the difference, right? Bivocational, right? I work full time. I don't take anything from the church because I don't need to, right? And I don't want to. I just want the church to be blessed, right? And so there are pastors that are bivocational that don't collect anything, and there are some that are full time. Some larger churches they use. I've heard they use the school, like a school principal is equivalent to a pastor salary. So whatever the local school principals make, that's what I've heard that used. There are some organizations that do church accountability and ministry accountability, and they publish guides for pastors and pastor pay and different things like that. But it's really the community, the size of the church, what the income is. I will tell you, I don't think, I'll leave that alone.
If you're bivocational, starting your own church, you're working a regular job, do you have the ability to do tax deductions for, if you're paying for everything out of what you're making during the week and you're renting a building or something, does that become tax deductible out of your own paycheck? If nobody else is supporting the church but you're making it happen.
So a pastor, I believe the pastor should also tithe to the church, right? So again, I'm bivocational. I don't take a salary, but I pay tithe. I give tithes to the church. So my recommendation to people, so again, the government gives us the ability to have tax deductible donations, right? So if you're in that tax bracket or you can itemize and take that benefit, why not? The government gives it to you. And we don't give just so we can get a tax deduction, but it is a benefit that the government allows us. I've had people come to me and say, hey, I want to donate, I'm going to go buy a sound system for the church for the youth ministry. It's going to cost $1,200. I tell them, no, I would rather you donate $1,200. The church will go buy the sound system. Now you get the benefit of giving a donation, and I own the sound system. The church, owns the sound system. Now, if you get mad, you can't go, well, I bought the sound system. I'm going to take that and I'm going to leave, right? See the difference? Now, you can claim all that. If I go,
Well, what I'm asking is if you start a church and you have 5 people coming and none of them are giving, they just can't give,
Sure.
and you're paying for a building to rent on the weekend out of your own paycheck, you're not giving yourself a salary.
Okay.
You set that up as a church entity, and the money that I would pay as if I was the pastor, nobody else is paying the rent, so
Right.
I'm paying the rent. So how does that work? Does that just become a tax deduction for me
you can do it
at the
both
end of
ways.
the year,
You can
or
say, this is a non-taxable gift that I'm giving. You can
to
claim
the
those.
church?
I would prefer that you have your church checking account and the rent for your building's $1,200, that you tithe $1,200 and you write it on your giving receipt that you tithe $1,200, and you do that every month. So you've tithed, $14,400 that year, but it went to pay for the rent. So
And
now you
can
have a
you-
legitimate receipt that says, I gave to the church. You can give to your own church. I give to my own church.
And
Right.
can you set up your own payroll in there and give to that and
These guys,
take
Pastor Scott,
and
these guys
take
have
a-
all these loopholes. I
and
don't know what, it's like.
and take a housing deduction out of that and say, I mean, I'm just asking. I mean, if you set all that up and you're the only one funding it, how does that work? Can it work?
It technically, if you want to give the church $50,000 a year as tithe, and then you want to take 48,000 back as salary,
Or
You-
20
you can do all
or
that.
30,000 as a housing?
You can technically you could do all that.
It's not a loophole. It's just, it's got to get paid anyway. Any, I think, I've never started a church, but Matthew, how do you kind of make that transition from being bivocational into that?
Well,
And
and really, when God calls you to start a ministry, everyone I know that's ever started a ministry has put in incredible amounts of sacrifice and personal finances that God puts on their financial record, right? Not to I'm not talking prosperity gospel. I don't believe in prosperity gospel, right? I don't believe in seed faith, all that stuff. I believe that God rewards those who diligently seek him. And I've experienced it in my life as my mother and father poured everything they had into ministry and only took what was absolutely the basics that they needed to live, be so abundantly blessed. And when God calls you to start a ministry and you know it's of God, you honestly, I don't think you really even care about how much you put in, and all that. At the end of the day, it's just like, you know what, God's called me to do it. God's going to provide. And then at some point, as God blesses it, then you're able to start receiving a salary. But it's not that you go into it to, oh, I'm going to recover all of that I put in at the beginning, and it just goes on your account in heaven. I guess that's how I look at it. Can you do all that stuff? Yeah, I don't know that you'd have to run the numbers. I don't know that it all works. So, any other questions, comments? You guys are an easy bunch. Got 5 minutes. So I know it's a lot to take in, and I'm sure most of you aren't even at that place yet, and some of you just decided you're never going to go into ministry because of it, and that's okay. You don't know where God's going to use you. So yes, sir.
Something happens where you are subjected to litigation because of, I don't know, you didn't have your bylaws say something about what marriage was, and then a homosexual couple wants to have their cake and eat it too. Sorry, I had to say that one.
Right.
Wants to have, you look bad and then sue you later.
That's why liability insurance is important. I mean, Brotherhood Mutual, Church Mutual are two good companies, and they will help guide you through some of those things.
But is a lot of that prevented by a good set of bylaws?
Yes. Even a good statement of faith. Because what I read you on marriage was out of the statement of faith. It wasn't even the bylaws. The statement of faith gets incorporated in the bylaws. One of the bylaws is that we adhere to this statement of faith, and you attach it. But just having a document that says this is what we believe about creation, about marriage, about God, the Trinity, baptism of the Holy Spirit, second coming of Christ, rapture, all of those things, you eliminate a lot of problems by just having that document. It's on our website. You can go look at Christian Fellowship Los Lunas of Los Lunas, and our whole statement of faith is on there. And so if somebody comes in and says, well, I didn't know they believe this way, it's public information. It's on our website. It's right there. And most churches, if you go onto their website, it says what we believe. And then you post it there. And then
I do have that. I don't have a sufficient set of bylaws, and I think that the statement of faith probably needs to include a whole lot more for the sake of liturgy, or litigation, I should say. Protect that. Red flags are flying all over me right now.
Well, and your bylaws aren't something you publish. Your bylaws are an internal document that go with your incorporation, and it's an internal document for the church. And we haven't published our bylaws.
Okay, good. Question kind of expanding on his question. Could you state in your statement or in your statement of faith, could you say for the purposes of liability, this is what we believe because of the politics of
Personally, I wouldn't. I would leave all that out. I mean, you're not writing a statement of faith to prevent yourself from a lawsuit. You're writing a statement of faith for what you believe, right? For the sake of all that, and COVID has done a lot in our world for creating people to fear. I don't want you to fear, right? God has not given us a spirit of fear, right? And so what I'm here to do is help you to do things right and help you to get things in order. And you know the things you need to do now, and you can work on them and be like Moses, assign some other people and say, hey, I can't do this all. I need you to help me with this, and let's all get together and talk about a statement of faith, and let's get that published, or let's work on bylaws or whatever. But we're doing ministry for discipleship, for this is who we are, this is what we believe. And preventing litigation is what you have insurance for, and some of those kinds of things. So I personally would not be motivated by doing things to prevent litigation. Because you know what? It doesn't matter what you do. If they want to sue you, they're going to sue you, right? You can have all of those things, and you can still be sued. So I wouldn't be motivated by that. That's me personally.
Okay, I got another question expanding on his.
I don't remember his, so
His was pay for pastors paid,
right.
and it's something that I just kind of assumed that like pastors of big churches that are like mega churches, I kind of assumed that maybe they just get a percentage, and so if the church is doing really well, that they would get a percentage of that. Is that
I have no idea.
legal, moral, and ethical to do that?
So I know of churches, like I said, I've been involved in helping many churches, and there are some people, and remember what I said at the beginning, churches are not a business, but they have a business aspect to them, right? Church is a ministry. But there are certain things we have to do as our ministry grows, and there are people being paid and all those kinds of things. Um, I think the Bible's clear that the worker is worthy of his hire. I mean that, and um, but what I tried not to say earlier was I disagree with mega churches where pastors are making millions of dollars. Right? Well, how much is enough? I mean, are you in it for the money, or are you in it for the ministry? Right? And we this faith ministry is going to go out of business if we don't get your income. Right? It's like, well, where's the faith in that part? Right? Again, where God guides, God provides. And as you get into ministry, you're going to make decisions that don't make sense on pen and paper, but God's leading you to do it, and God steps in and intervenes because that's who our God is, right? So I don't know. I mean, you can Google a lot of people and see what their net worth is, and you go, oh my goodness, they're running this ministry, and they're on their ministry saying, hey, we need your money so we can go take care of these starving children. It's like, well, you have enough money to take care of all those starving children. Why aren't you using your money? I'm just practical that way, but you know, and there are people, Paul even talks about it, that get into ministry for the wrong reason, right? Well, hey, it's a good vocation, they get paid well, and they only work on Sunday. Well, yeah, try that one, right? It's 24/7, right? And you don't get paid well. And if your church does become a mega church, I think, man, it's like you got to stand before God and give an account for all those things. So I would that's just me personally. What some of them do, I don't know. I will say this. I have been around churches where it's like, oh, every year let's give a Christmas bonus, and oh, it's like these are things that are done in the world that carry over into the church. Is it a sin? It's not, right? But you know, how would it be viewed by other people, right?
I just got an easy question. So were your parents happy? Because
My-
you said they were blessed, but even though they gave all that they gave, were they happy?
They were very happy, married 60 years, and just served well together in ministry, and never without anything. I don't remember. My dad was a giver, and I remember as a child, me and my brothers, we were in a small church and a lot of farmers, and it's like somebody would bring in an apple pie, or there would be a basket, and there's a watermelon and some cantaloupe and everything, and we were all like, oh, excited, we got some of this. We get home, hey, Dad, where's the watermelon? Oh, I gave it to so and so at church. You what? He goes, well, they were in need. We're like, we're in need. But we learned the value of giving rather than receiving, right? And we learned so much from that. My dad never sold a car. Never sold a car he owned. He gave every car he ever owned away. And even after he passed away, we had a car we wanted to get rid of, and we gave it away because that's what he would have done. The other thing he did is God put it on his heart that he was going to build the church, and we were going to do it debt-free. And so when we started building in 1979, it took us 5 years to finish the construction. But when it was done, it was 100% paid for, and it's never been in debt since 1980, whatever, since 1977. And so we have a lot of freedom in ministry, and we don't need a lot of income to do ministry because we're debt free. Not everybody can do that. It's not for everybody to do, right? And so I'm just telling you how God led him to do ministry. Right? And so, like I say, every ministry is different, and sometimes you have to lease. Sometimes you have to go in debt to build. And again, where God guides, he provides. You just want to make sure it's God guiding and not you building a bigger barn or having an ego or something that goes with that. I don't know if I answered your question or not, but yeah. Because it's not wealth and things that make you happy, right? It's the heart for serving the Lord. All right, guys, let's stand up. Let's close in a word of prayer. Father God, we thank you so much for your faithfulness. Lord, I thank you for all these men in this room that you have put in this class, in this shepherd school, Lord, for a purpose. Some of them, even tonight, still don't know what that purpose is, but they know you've called them here and you have a plan for their life. And so I pray that you would make that known to them and show them, and that you'd use them for your kingdom. And that you would just give them a heart to serve you, no matter what it takes, no matter where it is, no matter what the cost, because you paid the greatest cost of all for our salvation and to have a relationship with you, and that was the blood of Jesus Christ. Father, we thank you for that incredible gift, and we just pray that we would be good stewards of that gift and minister to others. So bless these men, encourage them, strengthen them, and give them vision for what you have them to do. And we ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. All right. God bless you guys.